The dust never stopped blowing in Cedar County. It covered everything like a gray blanket that nobody asked for. Grace Morrison stood at her bedroom window, watching the wind carry away what was left of their wheat field. The crops that should have been golden and ready for harvest looked like broken twigs poking through cracked earth. She pressed her face against the glass and sighed. This was the third year without rain. 3 long years of watching their farm slowly die while her father grew more desperate and her mother grew more silent. Grace was 16 now, old enough to understand what was happening to their family, old enough to know why her sisters kept disappearing one by one. The house felt too quiet these days. It used to be full of noise and laughter when all 6 Morrison girls lived under one roof. Elizabeth used to sing while doing dishes. Mary would tell silly jokes that made everyone giggle. Ruth always hummed while braiding hair, but now the kitchen felt empty, even when Grace and her parents sat together for dinner. Her mother, Margaret, moved around like a ghost. She cooked and cleaned without saying much, but Grace could see the pain in her eyes. Every time one of her daughters left, a little more light went out of her. She had been the kind of mother who baked cookies for no reason and told bedtime stories long after her girls were too old for them. Now she barely spoke at dinner. Grace's father, Thomas, was different too. He used to be the kind of man who would swing his daughters around in the yard and teach them about farming. He would point to the sky and predict rain, always hopeful about next season's crop. But the drought changed him. His shoulders sagged now, and his hands shook when he thought nobody was looking. The first sister to leave was Elizabeth. She was 22 and the prettiest of all the Morrison girls. A cattle rancher from Wyoming came looking for a wife, and he had money to offer. Grace remembered the day Elizabeth packed her small suitcase, trying to smile while tears ran down her cheeks. She hugged Grace tight and whispered, "Take care of Mama for me." That was 2 years ago. Grace never heard from Elizabeth again. Then came the others. One by one, men would come to their door. Some were farmers looking for help with their land. Others were miners or ranchers from faraway places. They all had one thing in common. They had money and the Morrison family needed it desperately. Grace tried not to think about what her sisters' lives were like now. She hoped they were happy, but deep down she worried. These men were strangers, who saw her sisters as solutions to their problems, not as real people with dreams and feelings. The bank letters started coming more often. Grace would watch her father's face turn pale every time he opened one. The farm was 3 months behind on payments. The general store wouldn't give them credit anymore. Even the neighbors who used to help each other through tough times were struggling too much to lend a hand. Last week, Grace overheard her parents talking late at night. She wasn't trying to listen, but their voices carried through the thin walls of their old farmhouse. "We can't keep her forever, Margaret," her father said quietly. "She's 16 now, old enough." "She's still a baby," her mother whispered back. "Our baby. The baby needs to eat too, we all do." Grace pulled her blanket over her head, trying not to hear any more. But she already knew what they were talking about. She was the last daughter left, and her time was running out. The next morning, she found her father sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in his hands. His face looked older than his 50 years, with deep lines around his eyes and gray, hair that seemed grayer every day. Grace poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him. "What's that, Papa?" she asked, even though she was afraid to know. Thomas looked up at his youngest daughter. Grace had her mother's green eyes and her grandmother's stubborn chin. She was small but strong, with calloused hands from helping with farm work. She deserved better than what he was about to tell her. "It's from a man in Montana," he said slowly. "A cattle buyer named Buck Peterson. He's looking for a wife." Grace's coffee cup rattled as she set it down. Her hands were shaking, but she tried to keep her voice steady. "What did you tell him?" "I haven't answered yet." Thomas folded the letter carefully. "Grace, you know how bad things are. The bank is going to take the farm if we don't pay them soon. This man, he's offering good money. Enough to save everything." "How much money?" Grace asked quietly. Her father couldn't look at her when he answered. $300. $300. More money than their family had seen in 3 years. Enough to pay the bank and buy food and maybe even fix the roof that leaked every time it rained, which wasn't often these days, but still. Grace stared out the window at their dying fields. She thought about her sisters, scattered across the western territories like seeds blown by the wind. She thought about her mother's sad eyes and her father's shaking hands. She thought about Buck Peterson, a stranger who wanted to buy a wife like he might buy a horse. "What's he like?" she asked. Thomas shifted in his chair. "He says he's 45, owns a big ranch, lost his first wife to fever last year, 45 years old, almost 3 times Grace's age." She wondered if he was kind or cruel, if he would treat her well or just use her up like everything else in their hard lives. When does he want an answer? Soon. He's planning to come through Cedar County next month on his way back to Montana. He could take you with him then. Take you with him. Like a piece of luggage or a cow being moved to pasture. Grace felt sick to her stomach, but she tried not to show it. Her parents had enough to worry about without seeing how scared she was. That afternoon, Grace walked to the old oak tree where she used to play with her sisters. It was the only tree on their property that hadn't died from the drought, though its leaves looked brown and brittle. She sat in the shade and tried to imagine what her life would be like in Montana. Would Buck Peterson's ranch be green? Or would it be as dusty and brown as their farm? Would he expect her to love him? Or would he be satisfied if she just cooked his meals and cleaned his house? Would she ever see her family again, or would she disappear like her sisters? Grace picked up a handful of dry dirt and let it run through her fingers. This land had been in her family for 20 years. Her father had built their house with his own hands, board by board. Her mother had planted a garden that used to bloom with vegetables and flowers. Now it was all dying, and selling their last daughter was the only way to save it. But Grace wasn't ready to give up yet. She was the daughter who climbed trees when her sisters played with dolls. She was the one who helped her father with the heavy farm work, when the boys from neighboring farms had to leave for factory jobs in the city. She had inherited her grandmother's fighting spirit, and something inside her refused to accept that. Becoming Buck Peterson's wife was her only choice. As the sun began to set, painting the dusty sky orange and pink, Grace made a decision. She would find another way. She had to. Not just for herself, but for her parents, who had already lost too much. There had to be something else, some other solution that didn't involve selling their last daughter to a stranger. She just had to figure out what it was before Buck Peterson came calling. James Sullivan stood in front of his empty house, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The morning sun cast long shadows across his front porch, but he didn't notice. He hadn't really noticed much of anything since the funeral. 3 weeks ago. The house behind him was too quiet. It used to be filled with Clara's humming while she cooked breakfast and her gentle voice reading aloud from books she loved. Now the silence felt heavy, like a blanket that was too thick and made it hard to breathe. He should go inside and get ready for school. The children were counting on him to teach them reading and arithmetic. But his feet felt like they were made of lead, and the thought of facing all those bright young faces made his chest tight. James had been the school teacher in Cedar Falls for 8 years. Before Clara died, he loved his job. He loved watching children's eyes light up when they finally understood a difficult lesson. He loved helping them discover new worlds through books. But now everything felt pointless and gray. Clara had been sick for only 2 days before the fever took her. 2 days wasn't enough time to say goodbye properly. James kept thinking of all the conversations they would never have and all the plans that would never happen. They had been so excited about the baby coming. Clara would spend evenings knitting tiny blankets and talking about what they would name their child. The baby had been due in December. Clara used to joke that their little one would be a Christmas present. Instead, James spent December putting flowers on 2 graves instead of rocking a baby to sleep. His neighbors meant well, but they didn't know what to say. Mrs. Henderson from the bakery brought him bread twice a week and always lingered on his doorstep, clearly wanting to help but not knowing how. Mr. Peterson, who lived next door, had offered to fix James's broken fence, but James just thanked him and said he would get to it later. He never did. The truth was, James didn't care about the fence or much of anything else. He went through the motions of living because he had to, not because he wanted to. He taught his classes because the children needed him, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. He ate because his body required food, but everything tasted like sawdust. At night, he would sit in the rocking chair Clara had picked out for the nursery. He would hold one of her books and try to remember the sound of her voice, reading to him. Sometimes he would talk to her picture on the mantel, telling her about his day like she was still there to listen. The other teachers at school worried about him. Miss Betty, who taught the younger children, kept leaving little notes in his desk drawer. Simple things like, thinking of you, or, the children love your stories. James appreciated her kindness, but he couldn't find the energy to respond properly. One afternoon in late October, James was walking home from school when he overheard Mrs. Henderson talking to her friend outside the general store. He didn't mean to listen, but their voices carried in the crisp autumn air. "It's such a shame about the Morrison family," Mrs. Henderson was saying. "That poor farmer has been selling off his daughters one by one just to keep food on the table." "All of them?" her friend asked, sounding shocked. "5 so far. Only the youngest is left, and she's just 16. Sweet little thing named Grace. I saw her in town last month, and she looked so worried. Can't imagine what that family is going through." James stopped walking. He had heard stories about families struggling during the drought, but somehow the reality of it hadn't really sunk in until now. A man selling his daughters to survive. A 16-year-old girl facing the same fate as her sisters. "What kind of men are buying these girls?" the friend asked. Mrs. Henderson lowered her voice, but James could still hear her. "Rough types mostly. Ranchers and miners looking for wives who won't ask questions or cause trouble. That youngest? Girl Grace, she's got spirit though. Reminds me a bit of James Sullivan's Clara when she was that age. Same stubborn chin and bright eyes." James felt something stir in his chest for the first time in weeks. Not happiness exactly, but something closer to purpose. He thought about Clara and how she had always worried about people who had less than they did. She would bring soup to sick neighbors and spend her own money on school supplies for children whose families couldn't afford them. What would Clara want him to do if she were here? That evening, James sat in his kitchen and really looked around, for the first time since the funeral. The house was a mess. Dishes piled in the sink, dust covering the furniture, clothes scattered around because he couldn't bring himself to do laundry. But underneath the neglect, it was still a good house. A house big enough for a family, with a garden that Clara had loved and rooms that echoed with loneliness. James had a steady job and a decent income. He owned his house outright and had some money saved in the bank. Most importantly, he had his good name in the community. People respected him as a teacher and had known him as a devoted husband. An idea began to form in his mind. It wasn't about replacing Clara or trying to recapture what he had lost. It was about doing something good with the life he still had left. Something that might honor Clara's memory and help someone who desperately needed help. The next morning, James cleaned himself up properly for the first time in weeks. He shaved, put on a clean shirt, and combed his hair. Then he walked to Mrs. Henderson's bakery and asked her to tell him more about the Morrison family. Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up when she saw him looking more like his old self. "Oh, James, it's so good to see you taking care of yourself again. Clara would be pleased." James smiled sadly. "She would have wanted me to help if I could. Tell me about this family." Mrs. Henderson poured him coffee and settled in to talk. She told him about Thomas Morrison, a proud farmer brought low by circumstances, beyond his control, about Margaret Morrison, a mother watching her children disappear one by one, and about Grace, the last daughter, who was running out of time. "The girl has been helping her father with farm work since she was small," Mrs. Henderson said. "She's smart as a whip and not afraid of hard work. But she's also got a gentle heart. I've seen her be kind to the younger children in town, always patient and sweet with them." "What will happen to her?" James asked. Mrs. Henderson's face grew serious. "Same thing that happened to her sisters, I suppose. Some man will offer enough money for her hand and her father will have to accept. It's not that he doesn't love his daughters, James. He just doesn't have any other choice." James finished his coffee in silence, thinking. That afternoon he did something he hadn't done in weeks. He cleaned his house from top to bottom. He washed dishes and did laundry and swept floors. He opened windows to let in fresh air and light. Then, he sat down at his kitchen table and wrote a letter to Thomas Morrison. His hand shook a little as he formed the words, but his purpose was clear. He wasn't looking for love or trying to replace what he had lost. He was simply offering what Clara would have offered if she were still alive: kindness to someone who needed it. The letter was simple and honest. James introduced himself as a schoolteacher and widower. He explained that he had heard about the Endo family situation and wanted to make a different kind of offer. Not a purchase, but a proposal. He could provide a good home, respect, and the chance for Grace to help with teaching if she was interested. Most importantly, he would give her the choice to say no. James sealed the letter and walked to the post office before he could change his mind. As he dropped it in the mail slot, he felt something he hadn't felt since Clara died. Not happiness, but hope. Maybe this was how he could honor his wife's memory and find a new purpose for his life. Maybe saving someone else could help. Save himself too. Grace was feeding the chickens when she saw the stranger walking up their dirt road. She straightened up and shaded her eyes with her hand, trying to get a better look at him. He was tall and thin, wearing a clean brown suit and carrying his hat in his hands. He walked slowly, like someone who wasn't in a hurry to arrive. Her heart started beating faster. This had to be Buck Peterson, the cattle buyer from Montana. He was supposed to come next week, but maybe he had changed his plans. Grace dropped the chicken feed and ran toward the house. "Papa," she called. "Someone's coming." Thomas Morrison stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on an old towel. He squinted at the approaching figure and frowned. "That's not Buck Peterson," he said quietly. "This man's too young and too well dressed." Grace felt a mixture of relief and confusion. If it wasn't the cattle buyer, then who was it? Strangers didn't usually come to their farm unless they wanted something. The man reached their front gate and stopped. He looked nervous, like he was rehearsing what he planned to say. When he saw Grace and her father watching him, he took a deep breath and walked the rest of the way to their porch. "Mr. Morrison?" he asked, his voice gentle and uncertain. "That's me," Thomas replied. "What can I do for you?" The stranger put his hat back on and then immediately took it off again. Grace could see his hands shaking slightly. "My name is James Sullivan. I'm the schoolteacher over in Cedar Falls. I wrote you a letter, but I decided it was better to come speak with you in person." Thomas and Grace exchanged glances. They hadn't received any letter from a schoolteacher. The mail didn't always make it out to their farm on time, especially lately. "I'm afraid we didn't get your letter, Mr. Sullivan," Thomas said. "But you're welcome to tell us what it said." James looked even more nervous now. He glanced at Grace, then back at her father, then at his feet. Grace had never seen a grown man look so unsure of himself. "Perhaps we should sit down," Thomas suggested, gesturing to the old wooden chairs on their porch. "Grace, could you fetch us some water?" Grace nodded and went inside, but she left the door open so she could hear what the stranger had to say. Her mother Margaret appeared beside her, looking curious and worried at the same time. "Who is that man?" Margaret whispered. "A schoolteacher named James Sullivan," Grace whispered back. "He says he wrote Papa a letter." They moved closer to the door to listen as James began to speak. "Mr. Morrison, I heard about your family's situation through some folks in town. I know this might sound strange, but I wanted to make you an offer regarding your daughter." Grace felt her stomach drop. Another man wanting to buy her. But there was something different about the way he said it. His voice was respectful, not demanding. "What kind of offer?" Thomas asked carefully. James was quiet for a moment. Grace could hear him shifting in his chair. "I'm a widower, Mr. Morrison. My wife Clara died 3 weeks ago along with our unborn child. I have a good house and a steady income, but I'm alone now. I've been thinking about what Clara would want me to do with the life I have left." Margaret grabbed Grace's arm gently. This wasn't what either of them had expected to hear. "I'm not looking to buy your daughter," James continued. "I'm asking if she would consider marrying me, a real marriage, with respect and kindness. She would have her own room until she felt comfortable, and she could help me teach the children in town if she wanted to. Most importantly, The choice would be hers to make. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She had been expecting Buck Peterson with his rough hands and his cattle ranch. Instead, here was a soft-spoken teacher, offering her something she had never dared to hope for: a choice. Thomas was quiet for a long time. Grace could imagine him studying this unexpected visitor, trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. "Why would you do this?" Thomas finally asked. "You don't know us. You don't know Grace." "That's true," James admitted. "But I know what it's like to lose everything that matters, and I know that my wife would never forgive me if I had the power to help someone and chose not to use it. Your daughter deserves better than being sold to the highest bidder." Grace felt tears starting in her eyes. No one had ever talked about what she deserved before. It had always been about what the family needed or what men wanted. "What exactly are you offering?" Thomas asked. James cleared his throat. "A home where Grace would be treated as a wife, not a servant. I make enough money to support us both comfortably. She could continue her education. I have plenty of books, and I could teach her things that might help her in life. If she wanted to help with the school, she could earn a little money of her own. And if someday she decided she wanted to leave, I wouldn't stop her." Grace had never heard of a man saying his wife could leave if she wanted to. That was the most surprising thing of all. Margaret squeezed Grace's arm again and whispered, "Go out there. You should be part of this conversation." Grace took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch. Both men looked up at her and she felt her cheeks grow warm under their attention. "I'm Grace," she said simply. James stood up quickly and nodded respectfully. "Miss Grace, I'm James Sullivan. I hope you don't mind me coming here like this." Grace studied his face. He had kind eyes, sad but not cruel. His hair was brown with a little gray at the temples, and he looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of recent grief. "How old are you, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked. 35, he replied honestly. 19, years older than her, but not as old as Buck Peterson. And he was a teacher, which meant he was educated and probably gentle. "Tell me about your wife," Grace said, surprising everyone, including herself. James's face softened. "Clara was wonderful. She loved to read and garden. She was kind to everyone she met, and she always tried to help people who were struggling. She died of fever while carrying our first child." Grace could hear the pain in his voice, but also the love. A man who spoke about his dead wife that way was probably a good man. "Do you expect me to love you?" Grace asked directly. James shook his head. "No. I expect you to be treated with respect and kindness. Love might come later or it might not. That would be up to both of us." Grace looked at her father, who was watching her with worried eyes. She thought about Buck Peterson and his cattle ranch in Montana. She thought about her sisters, scattered to the winds and never heard from again. She thought about this quiet teacher who had driven all the way from Cedar Falls to offer her something no one else had: a choice. "Can I have some time to think about it?" she asked. "Of course," James said. "Take all the time you need. I'll be staying at the boarding house in town for a few days." As Grace watched him walk back down their dirt road, she realized that for the first time in months she felt something that wasn't fear. She felt hope. Maybe there was another way forward after all. Maybe she didn't have to disappear like her sisters. Maybe this sad, kind teacher was offering her a chance at a real life. That night, Grace lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine what it would be like to be married to James Sullivan. It wouldn't be easy, but it might be good. And good was more than she had dared to hope for in a very long time. Grace said yes on a cold November morning, standing in the same spot where James had first asked for her hand. She had spent 3 days walking through the dying fields, thinking about her choices. Buck Peterson or James Sullivan, a rough stranger who saw her as property, or a gentle teacher who offered her respect. The decision wasn't really that hard when she looked at it that way. James smiled for the first time since Clara's death when Grace told him her answer. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real. He shook hands with Thomas Morrison and promised to take good care of their daughter. Margaret Morrison cried, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. "She'll have a better life with you than anything we could give her here," Margaret whispered to James as she hugged him goodbye. The wedding took place on a gray December morning in the small white church in Cedar Falls. Grace wore her mother's old blue dress carefully altered to fit her smaller frame. The fabric was faded but clean, and Margaret had sewn tiny pearl buttons down the back that had belonged to Grace's grandmother. James wore his best black suit, the same one he had worn to Clara's funeral 6 weeks earlier. Mrs. Henderson had convinced him to buy a small bouquet of winter flowers for Grace. They weren't much to look at, but Grace held them like they were the most precious thing in the world. Only a handful of people attended the ceremony. Mrs. Henderson and her husband sat in the front pew, along with Miss Betty from the school. Thomas and Margaret Morrison had made the long trip from their farm, looking out of place in their patched clothes, but proud of their daughter nonetheless. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony with gentle kindness. He had buried James's first wife and knew this wedding was more about rescue than romance. When he asked James if he would take Grace as his wife, James's voice was steady but quiet. When he asked Grace the same question, her voice was clear and sure. They exchanged simple, gold bands that James had bought from the general store. As he slipped the ring onto Grace's finger, she noticed his hands were shaking slightly. She looked up into his face and saw not passion or joy, but a kind of peaceful determination. This man was doing what he believed was right, even though his heart was still broken. After the ceremony, Mrs. Henderson insisted on hosting a small dinner at her house. She had made roast chicken and apple pie, treating the occasion with more celebration than either James or Grace felt ready for. But her kindness was genuine, and they appreciated having friends around them on such an uncertain day. Grace's parents stayed long enough to eat dinner and say their goodbyes. Thomas pressed a small wooden box into Grace's hands as they prepared to leave. "This was your grandmother's," he said quietly. "She always said it should go to the daughter who needed it most." Inside the box was a delicate silver locket with a tiny photograph of her grandmother as a young woman. Grace fastened it around her neck and felt like she was carrying a piece of her family with her into this new life. The ride to James's house was quiet. They sat side by side in his small wagon, listening to the clip-clop of the horse's hooves on the frozen ground. Grace clutched her small suitcase in her lap, everything she owned in the world packed into one battered case. "Are you nervous?" James asked as they turned onto his street. "Yes," Grace answered honestly. "Are you?" "Terrified," he replied, and they both laughed a little. It was the first time Grace had laughed in months. James's house was bigger than Grace had expected. It was painted white with green shutters, and it had a front porch with 2 rocking chairs. There was a small garden in the yard that looked like it had been well tended before being abandoned to winter. "Clara loved that garden," James said, noticing Grace looking at it. "She grew vegetables and flowers. I haven't touched it since she died." Grace nodded, understanding that some things were too painful to face right away. Inside, the house was clean but felt empty. James had obviously made an effort to tidy up before bringing her home, but Grace could see the signs of a man living, alone and grieving. There were books stacked everywhere, dishes in the sink, and a layer of dust on the furniture. "I know it's not much," James said, suddenly seeming embarrassed by the state of his home. "It's beautiful," Grace said, and she meant it. After years of watching her family's farmhouse fall apart from poverty, James's solid house felt like a palace. He showed her to a small bedroom at the back of the house. It had been Clara's sewing room with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the garden. James had cleared out most of Clara's things, but Grace could still smell a faint trace of lavender in the air. "This is your room," James said. "You can arrange it however you like. I'm right down the hall if you need anything." Grace sat down, her suitcase, and looked around. Her own room. In all her life, she had shared a bedroom with at least 2 sisters. The idea of having a space that was completely hers felt almost impossible to believe. That first evening, they sat at the kitchen table and ate a simple dinner of bread and soup. The conversation was awkward, like 2 strangers trying to figure out how to be married. James told her about the school and the children he taught. Grace told him about helping her father with farm work and how she had always loved reading the few books her family owned. "I have plenty of books," James said, gesturing toward the shelves that lined the living room walls. "You're welcome to read any of them." Grace's eyes lit up. She had never seen so many books in one place. "Really? All of them?" "All of them," James confirmed. Clara loved to read too. She said books were like windows to other worlds. Over the following weeks, Grace began to settle into her new life. She cooked and cleaned, but James insisted on helping with the housework. He was used to taking care of himself and didn't expect her to wait on him like a servant. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and read. Sometimes James would read aloud from books he thought Grace might enjoy. His voice was gentle and expressive, and Grace found herself looking forward to these quiet hours together. Slowly, the house began to feel less empty. Grace brought life to the rooms with her cooking smells and her habit of humming while she worked. She started tending to the neglected houseplants, coaxing them back to health with careful watering and attention. James began to sleep better and eat more regularly. Having someone to care for gave him a sense of purpose beyond his grief. He started noticing small things again. The way morning light came through the kitchen window, the sound of Grace's laughter when he told her a funny story about his students. One evening in January, Grace was washing dishes when she heard James crying in the living room. She dried her hands and found him holding a photograph of Clara, tears streaming down his face. Instead of leaving him alone with his grief, Grace sat down beside him on the sofa. She didn't try to take the photograph away or tell him everything would be all right. She simply sat with him in his sadness. "Tell me about her," Grace said quietly. James looked surprised. "You really want to hear?" "Yes, she was important to you. That makes her important to me, too." So James told Grace stories about Clara, about how they met at a church social, how Clara could make anyone laugh, how excited she had been about becoming a mother. Grace listened without jealousy or resentment, understanding that his love for Clara didn't take anything away from their growing friendship. That night marked a turning point in their marriage. They began to talk more openly about their pasts, their fears, and their hopes. Grace told James about missing her sisters and worrying about whether they were happy. James told Grace about feeling guilty for surviving when Clara and their baby had died. Neither of them was ready for love yet, but they were building something just as valuable: trust, companionship, and the beginning of genuine care for each other. In a world that had been harsh to both of them, they were creating a small space of kindness and safety together. Spring came early that year, and with it, something neither James nor Grace had expected: hope. Grace was in the garden, planting seeds in the same beds where Clara had once grown tomatoes and roses. Her hands were dirty and her back ached, but she felt peaceful in a way she hadn't known was possible. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and she could hear James inside the house grading papers and occasionally chuckling at something one of his students had written. It had been 4 months since their wedding, and their life together had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Grace helped at the school 3 days a week, working with the younger children who struggled with reading. She had discovered that she loved teaching almost as much as she loved learning. James had been right about her having a natural gift for it. The children adored her. Little Bobby Peterson, who had been afraid to speak up in class, now raised his hand eagerly when Grace was there to encourage him. Lucy Henderson had finally learned to read complete sentences, and she would beam with pride every time Grace praised her progress. Grace felt useful in a way she never had before. At the farm, she had always been helping with chores that needed to be done for survival. Here she was helping children discover the joy of learning, and that felt like something much more meaningful. James watched Grace with the children and felt his heart stirring in ways he hadn't experienced since Clara's death. Grace had a patience and gentleness that reminded him why he had fallen in love with teaching in the first place. When she laughed at the children's silly questions or celebrated their small victories, her whole face lit up with genuine joy. One evening in March, James found Grace sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of letters. She had been writing to people in neighboring towns, asking if they knew anything about her sisters. It was a project she had started quietly, not wanting to seem ungrateful for her new life by dwelling on the past. "Any news?" James asked, sitting down across from her. Grace shook her head. "Nothing yet, but I keep hoping. I just want to know if they're safe and happy." James reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was the first time he had touched her since their wedding day, and both of them were surprised by how natural it felt. "We'll keep looking," he said. "Maybe someday we can even visit them." Grace smiled at him, and James felt something warm spread through his chest. He realized that somewhere in the past few months, his feelings for Grace had begun to change. She wasn't just the young woman he had rescued or the helpful companion who shared his house. She was becoming someone he genuinely cared about, someone whose happiness mattered to him as much as his own. The turning point came on a rainy April evening when Grace came home from the school looking troubled. One of the older students, 16-year-old Annie Morris, had confided in Grace about her family's financial problems. Annie's father had been talking about finding her a husband who could pay off their debts. "She's so scared, James," Grace said, pacing around their living room. "She reminds me of myself a year ago. She's smart and kind, and she deserves better than being sold off to some stranger." James had never seen Grace so worked up about anything. Her cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright with determination. "What can we do?" he asked. Grace stopped pacing and looked at him. "I want to help her. I want to help other girls like her. We have a good life now, James. We have enough money and a nice house. Shouldn't we use what we have to help people who need it?" James felt his heart swell with admiration and something deeper. This young woman who had been rescued herself was already thinking about how to rescue others. She had the same generous spirit that he had loved in Clara, but it was uniquely Grace's own. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. Grace sat down beside him, closer than she usually did. "What if we offered Annie a place to stay? She could help at the school and earn some money while she figures out what she wants to do with her life. And maybe we could do the same for other girls who need help." James looked into Grace's earnest face and felt something click into place. This was what his life was supposed to be about. Not just surviving his grief, but building something meaningful with this remarkable woman who had somehow become so important to him. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said. Grace's face broke into the biggest smile he had ever seen from her. Without thinking, she threw her arms around his neck and hugged him tight. James hugged her back, and for the first time since Clara's death, he felt completely present in the moment instead of lost in memories of the past. They helped Annie Morris, and then they helped 2 more girls whose families were struggling. Word spread quietly through the community about the young teacher and his wife, who offered safe places for girls who needed them. Their house became a sanctuary, a place where young women could work and learn and choose their own futures. Grace bloomed in this new role. She organized fundraisers for struggling families and convinced local business owners to hire the girls. They helped. James watched her grow more confident and capable every day, and his feelings for her deepened into something he hadn't expected to feel again. One warm evening in May, they were sitting on their front porch, watching the sunset. Grace was mending one of James's shirts and he was reading a book, but mostly they were just enjoying the peaceful end of another good day. "Grace," James said suddenly. She looked up from her sewing. "Yes? I need to tell you something." James set down his book and turned to face her. "I think I'm falling in love with you." Grace's needle stopped moving. She stared at him for a long moment, her heart beating so fast she was sure he could hear it. "I know this wasn't what either of us planned," James continued. "I know I married you to help you, not because I expected to feel this way. But somewhere along the way, you became the most important person in my world." Grace set down her sewing and reached for his hand. "I love you too, James. I've been afraid to say it because I didn't want to pressure you or make you feel guilty about Clara." James squeezed her hand. "Loving you doesn't mean I've forgotten Clara. It means I've learned that the heart is big, enough to hold both grief and joy, both past love and new love." That night, for the first time since their wedding, Grace moved her belongings into James's room. They held each other close and talked until dawn about their dreams for the future. They wanted to expand their work helping young women. They wanted to travel someday to find Grace's sisters. And they wanted to build a family of their own. 2 years later, Grace gave birth to their daughter. They named her Hope, because that's what she represented. Proof that beautiful things could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. As Grace held their baby girl for the first time, she thought about how far she had come from that scared 16-year-old who had almost been sold to a stranger. James looked at his wife and daughter and felt his heart overflow with gratitude. He had thought his life was over when Clara died, but Grace had shown him that sometimes the end of one chapter is just the beginning of another, even more beautiful story. Their love had been born from desperation and grief, but it had grown into something strong and lasting and real. They had saved each other, and now they were saving others, and that felt like the most meaningful life either of them could have asked for.